given the chatter, everybody seems to be sufficiently awake. So Dave, normally this is a dangerous session. In Afrikaans they say maag is vol, maag is vol, oog is toe. That on a full stomach people tend to be dozing off after lunch, but that doesn't seem to be the case here at all. I think there's a fair amount of excitement, and I'm sure your presentation will have us on the edge of our seats. But over to you, Dave.
I'm going to bank that clap because you may not be as happy after I finish. Thank you very much. And as you say, this is always the death spot. So I hope everyone had some nice coffee with their lunch as well and they don't fall asleep on me. And if you do fall asleep, we've got the music in the background and I'm going to crank up some videos and make sure you're awake. So what we're going to try and talk about, as the non-lawyer, I'm going to deal with commercials. And I'm going to deal with all this stuff, hopefully, that we think about, that legal decisions can impact significantly on, that aren't often thought about when the legal decisions are being debated, and the competition laws and how the effect it can have on you win the case, but you destroy the entire thing you were there to protect, which is the sport federation, the league, the broadcaster, and everything else. But I'm going to go high level. A lot of the stuff I was going to show, my colleagues before me have already touched on, so we'll whip through a few things. And hopefully, time permitting, I'll try and introduce a little case study at the end. Instead of the checkers one now, I'll introduce a little case study at the end that deals with women's sport, because we seem to be highly underrepresented in terms of women's sport, women panelists, and everything else. So I'll identify myself as a female today as a sports thing. But no. And that is changing. And I think in all spheres of life, whether it's media, whether it's sponsorship, one of the beautiful things about the Netball World Cup, which we'll get to, is the results it had as a women's sport and why that's so important and why it's so possible. Because one of the wonderful things I learned coming from North America to South Africa, and I've now spent half my life in both continents, was Africa just gets on with it. And while we can complain about how many things go against us, the rand and everything else, which are real difficulties, we can leapfrog technology. So we didn't have telephones, okay, we'll just go to mobile. We've caught up again. And I think sports rights are very much about that as well, and in particular, the opportunity with women's sports rights that aren't tied up in 10-year broadcast deals or 15 years or players' negotiations can force men's sport to wake up and start making changes because they're doing things that the men's sport isn't. So just bank that one for later, and we'll show you how we did it with the Netball World Cup. Very interesting, just from a commercial point of view, what is sponsorship, what is sports marketing, what is sports sponsorship? Our definitions are really, there's a financial transaction involved. And that transaction involves getting certain rights and or whatever, and it doesn't always have to be a monetary, it can be a value-in-kind transaction. And then what do we do with that? And so our job is looking at that whole basket of assets, if we want to call it, or fruits, and how do you juggle those to maximize the commercial value, either A, for the federation, or B, for the sponsors that are holding their logos on all the different things. And where competition or whatever comes into place is, do we have naming rights? Can there be exclusive rights? What does the competition law say about only having one bank allowed in football? Dare I go there? Or one betting company? How do we segment all of those branding rights? What are the different types of branding rights that a company like BMI measures in terms of the logo on the kit? How many logos? What size is the logo? All of these things are regulated individually by the sports codes themselves. We'll talk about a little bit maybe about the Springboks, and we'll talk about World Cups, which are probably the most regulated and where our ambush laws came from. But ironically, the greatest moment for a sponsor of a national team, i.e. the Springboks, when they go off to the World Cup and they pay millions and millions and millions of rands to be on the front of the jersey, MTN, or before them ABSA, or before them Sassel, and they get to the World Cup and they're not there. Only Nike's there, only the kids, similar to an Olympics. And what impact does that have locally and globally? particularly if they don't have any more money or don't go and buy the broadcast rights on top of it, and Checkers does, who isn't even a sponsor. And so these are things that have short-term gains and often long-term consequences, and that we have to weigh up all of those things when we're doing our commercial rights contracts and segment them into these various different benefits and classes and figure out how it all works out and how that puzzle works. And truly we knock ourselves, and I've had the pleasure or displeasure recently of dealing with a lot of European sponsorship agencies, rights negotiations, and we always say as ourselves as South Africans, we're so far behind. Well, monetarily, we're dealing with rands, not pounds, and in terms of scale, we have a massive disadvantage. There's no question. However, how we sweat the assets and what we do with the commercialization of broadcast rights and sponsorship rights far surpass anything I've seen in Europe. Far surpasses anything. And so we've got to take pages of how adept we are in our feet and maybe bring that into sports law and bring it into a whole other things where we can be leaders in those industries. And if you take one thing away from what I say today, hopefully that's it. Our ability to measure the rights, our ability to track, our ability to impact and package is one of our greatest assets and strengths because we don't sell a $6 million ad for the Super Bowl. So those other assets really matter. The naming rights of a stadium really matters and when we use them, because that's what pays for the sport. And I'll talk about the finances of sport in a minute. So when we walk into a room and Phil and I are sitting across each other from SAFA and SABC and SuperSport and PSL and whoever happens to be the rights holder, or we're selling broadcast rights, we used to have these very long 80, 90-page contracts. And some federations and some codes still do. And the ones highlighted in black are for you guys, the lawyers. The force majeures and the IPs and the confidentialities and all this stuff that I cut and paste because you guys have written it better than I can, right? Until it changes, and then we got to update it a bit. And the stuff in blue is the stuff that no one ever reads until the shit hits the fan. And we're fighting over commercial rights, which is what is invariably what makes the success and failure of the sponsorship long term. And those are those commercial rights. We used to spend days fighting over the definition, just for broadcast rights, because the broadcast platforms are changed. And is mobile free to air, or is it streaming, or is it OTT, or is it DTT, or is it DTH, or anything in the future that may or may not happen in the term of this contract, we were protecting against. And simple examples, how many people know what the SABC sports channel is? Do you know where to find it? It's on OpenView, OVHD, right? Now, you may not be able to cast it onto your TVs, but that's a debate for another story. But is that pay TV, or is it free to air? And who wants to debate it? Because if you ask two lawyers, you'll get 3 answers. Did I say that in a law conference? Sorry, I retract that, Your Honor. I'm still alive. Okay, it's a friendly crowd. I'm going to keep going. So these are the things we're dealing with, and how do you know, and the contracts have to change, and they have to reflect that, and they have to be flexible enough, and they have to understand how quickly the market is changing, how technology is changing everything overnight, how access will be a whole different conversation. One of the most frustrating things we had recently, sitting in the sports broadcasting CASA regulations for 5 days, debating the merits of what I'll talk about in a minute, aside from the fact that no decision was ever made, was that we didn't even talk about streaming. We didn't talk about OTT. We didn't talk about the future. We dealt with stuff that should have been dealt with 30 years ago that won't be applicable in 5. Yeah. And so, bottom line is, as I said a little bit earlier, sport is a big business. Sports sponsorship, there's job creation, there's agencies, there's hotel tourism, there's many spillovers that a lot of countries rely on. That a lot of countries rely on as a contribution. We have one of the highest contributions to GDP through sport. 2-3% compared to other bigger countries where maybe 1.5%, 2%. So there's a lot there, and it's a growing market. It's under massive pressure every day. And if anything, the sponsorship market, due to its own success, is almost slowed, if I can dare say so, because money's trickling to other things. Social media, it's easier to ambush, it's easier to work around things. But it's a 9 billion rand market. And that's important. That's your sponsorship. Globally, media rights for sport are what, 61 billion, 2023? Dollars, not rand, 61 billion US dollars, just for media rights. So we're talking big business, and obviously with big business comes money, and obviously with money comes legal suits. And it's something that we have to gear up and continue. When I talk about sports rights and revenue streams, because that's at the end of the day what makes it commercially viable, all of these leagues, teams, what have you, generally speaking worldwide, there's 4 sources of revenue. Or if you split it up, I think, Jacques, you had 5. Merchandising and licensing is one category or 2, depending on how you look at it. But there's 4 sources of revenue, which is basically broadcast, sponsorship, I call it merchandising and licensing, and then your ticketing and hospitality. Now, if you're a European football club, all 4 of those revenues matter. And arguably, depending on the club and depending on how rights are negotiated, it would be a 60-40 split. 60% broadcast and sponsorship, maybe 35 to 40% merchandising and licensing. You sell out your stadium at how many £100 a ticket? We raise the price beyond 30 rand for a soccer game and it's empty. As soon as you hit 50 rand, even a Chiefs Pirates game is going to battle to fill it up, depending on the stadium. And we're not selling that many tickets to begin with. Licensing and merchandising. We have a real, 800 rand a shirt. So we talked about the piracy market and how, the Nigerian flooded market is taking over and selling more shorts. Saying that, the amount we did in 1 week when we got the IPL that came to town because it couldn't go somewhere else, and the shirts that were sold, and the commercialization and our eventing capabilities, we're world class. In South Africa, when you take the context, we are so heavily overextended on broadcast and sponsorship because we do not have the other 2 sources of revenue. They're less than 5 to 15%. So 85% of your money for the big federations, if you're lucky enough to get any money from broadcast, are going to broadcast and are dependent on a super sport and or your free-to-air broadcasters, which really don't have the money recently to fund it. So when we make commercial decisions because the Springboks are in town today and it has to be on SABC, there's a great argument for access. Of course there is. They're the champions. They're the Springboks. We have to see them. But what cost? And does a one-day fix solve the next 5 years of contractual negotiations and who's paying for it and what are the ramifications thereafter? So those partnerships, that cooperation is absolutely essential. So we brought up the PSL, we brought up football. I knew Michael was talking about football as well. And so this is where the stats start coming into play. And, when you're talking money on the one hand, the broadcast rights are critical. But then you talk access on the other hand, and you go to a sponsor or sponsors of the PSL, and they say, Dave, but I'm sponsoring the PSL, but I'm not getting any games on free-to-air TV. There used to be 100 games on SABC, then it went down to, I think, 52, 48 in the previous contract, and it's around 50 again in the current renewal. But that sounds great, and we've all heard about there's 50 games on PSL, but last year there were 11 PSL games on SABC in total. The rest were for cup competitions, MTN 8, Nedbank Cup, Carling Black Label, the second division, Mostert Foundation, et cetera, et cetera. And so that will have a direct impact on every single team and their ability to raise sponsorship. But the balance between those two is that if they're making a heck of a lot of money from the broadcast rights that are split between the teams equally, well, maybe that outweighs the money that they could get extra from their sponsorship. And all of these things are a factor, and there's no easy answer to it. There's emotional answers, there's political answers, but there's also a reality, and at what point is that breaking point? Only the market and the market players will determine that. So the fact of the matter is, the good news story is that despite everyone fighting for eyeballs on pay TV, and we hear horrible stories, which I'll share with you, on how many subscriptions are being dropped at premium level, football is one of those rare win-win stories where, at least from the time SuperSport took over the PSL from SABC to Let's Go 2017, I'm going to skip quickly on that point and I'll come back. The revenues went up, the eyeballs went up. SABC actually, funny enough, showed more games on TV than when they had the exclusive rights themselves in the initial period. And so everything was wonderful. We had more money going into the sport, a lot more money going into the sport. We had more eyeballs. The thing was growing. The revenues were growing from 20 million to 500 million. Or you take the opposite and you say, I'm SAFA, and the people must come first. We must give access to the national team, right? They must be on SABC, which means that a pay TV broadcaster can no longer pay for the exclusivity to drive rights that warrant to pay for that right. So these are amazing trade-offs. Now, if you can take that extra 5 million, 10 million, 6 million, whatever it is, number of audience, and convince your sponsors to make up the difference between the broadcast revenue, you've got a win-win situation. But if that market doesn't exist, if there's not that competition for that market, then what? Right? And then you're funding, like I said with SAFA, you're funding, I don't know how many thousand teams with just your Bafana rights and hopefully now Banyana rights. And if those are now going to FIFA, what do you have left to sell? And how do you fund the sport? And where do the bodies all come together? And I don't want to pick on soccer or anything. It's the same for every federation. So let me just go back. And what we deal with when we deal with these types of issues is a classic. It's the simplest in the simplest terms. And this was from a Casa Sports broadcasting debates that I dug up from years. How many years ago was that? The first time? 17, 20, 23? It doesn't matter. But it's reach versus revenue. Right? It's fans, access to my public versus funding. Or in a satirical way, it's SABC versus Supersport. That's the simple truth. And how do you weigh and balance between the two? And is that something that we spent 5 days debating at Casa Sports broadcasting regulations and audiovisual and everything else? Is that something that the courts and judges should be doing? Lawyers should be doing, or those that are entrusted in the sport themselves, the federations? In the simplest terms, that's the commercial and or political and or legal argument that we deal with. I'm just going to let that sit in and see if I get anything thrown at me. So back to the numbers. And we had a nice case here from 2006 to 2017 that said the numbers can work and everybody can win. Okay, then what happened? I'm going to go to checkers now quickly. You did this already for me? Is it right or is it wrong is the question you have to ask in terms of ambush law. Is ambush even defensible? Is another story. That's what it looks like to Joe Fan, right? And they got lucky. They came out with the Listerine shirt. Someone made an ad in Checkers, which I'll show you in a second. And let's just play, let's just go and let's just play this. See if it'll come on.
What's my inspiration for a white kit design? I don't know. I'm an artist. It's hard to tell. You tell me. Is it 60-60? That's my order.
No, where did my presentation go? Sorry, guys. And that's how it actually started, I believe. And, you know, was it planned? Is it illegal? Is it not illegal? Does it matter? Sure, it matters. But then you go a step further and you say, well, how do these rights things work? I've got to come after Supersport now because Supersport sold them squeezebacks. It sold them on-screen logos. That's not right. Surely they're a partner of Saru. They're the biggest partner of Saru. How can my own partner throw me under the bus and let ambushers come in? Are they wrong? Legally, definitely not. Commercially, do they have a choice? they paid a lot of money for those rights. And the Springbok sponsors didn't come to the party and buy broadcast sponsorship, and the batteries weren't included in the deal. So we have a lot of expensive toys out there without any batteries to run it, was a coin we phrased about 10, 15 years ago. And so if they don't take those rights, and I believe they were offered, and there was first rights of refusal to all the sponsors. MTN didn't take. Why can't Checkers? It's totally within the law. And if they don't take, then SuperSport won't pay Saru or whoever it is the next week for those rights. Question for everybody in the room. How many people, because now this is where it starts getting blurry, right? When you have kit and when you have companies, and we talked about the only place where Checkers went over the line was at the last test, where one of the retailers actually went in and put a Castle Rugby Championship logo above a display of Boerewors and everything they were selling, and it got ripped down the next day. And so they did the right thing and they took it down. Now, the argument in court would probably go something along the lines, well, if your own senior management think you're a sponsor, surely the public does as well, Your Honor. And is that passing off and all the rest of that stuff? Irrespective of if they did the right thing or not, because all the other things go to that same thing. But this is what a broadcast looked like, and there's nothing wrong with having a Checkers 60-60 squeeze back in the middle of a rugby game because they paid for it. And if you think it's wrong, then when you do those rights, you've got to make sure that it's covered that you can't do those things. And where do you draw the line? No one complained if it wasn't successful. They only complained when it started taking traction. And so these are the things we grapple with. And if you don't have these things in your mind when you're designing the commercial rights and protecting longer term, then these fights will continue to happen, and they're going to happen easier. And it's easier to do these type of things because of the rapid change of social and technology and online. So I'm not going to show that. I mean, here's just the ad. Let's see if it'll play. To me, I look at the background. I look at how the logos, the LED boards. It is so passing off. It's almost ridiculous, yet who wants to fight this one in court? All right, I want to leave it there. You get the idea. So then that begs the question, because we're talking about, you know, what was it early? In the public interest. And I've got to whip through these slides really quickly now. In the public interest, and what do the numbers say? So how many people watched, Ireland came, it was number 1, 2 in the world, the first test back after the World Cup. How many people saw that on TV? Any guesses? Yeah, yell them out. 20 million. Whew. We've never had that audience ever in South Africa. I'm talking only in South Africa now, okay. 3 million is generally the answer. I get 2 million, 3 million, 1.5 million. Remember, the game was only on SuperSport, and it was only on SuperSport Rugby and Grandstand. And the answer is, for the entire Castlelager Rugby Series Championship, 900,000 people. Yeah. Then there's South Africa versus New Zealand, which we heard all the noise about. And SuperSport, to its credit, has been incredibly good. They're starting to understand their markets. They're starting to understand the different subscriptions. They're putting it on multiple channels. In particular, with this game, you can see just from adding SS Variety 3 brings in a different subscriber base. And these numbers of 800,000 are phenomenal on SuperSport alone. And then we got to add SABC, and we got another 1.3 million. Okay, we don't have to talk about it anymore. We got 2 million audience. The Springboks were taken care of. Cape Town, don't worry about it next week. We've done our thing. Let's move on. It's a short-term Band-Aid. Even from an SAPC point of view, while it's critically important they did it, if you get the game a week before, how do you commercialize it and make back the money? It's impossible unless a sponsor comes to your rescue and pays for it, which will have other long-term ramifications in terms of the commercialization of their broadcast in sport. Future sports funding, streaming. We've got big streaming issues coming. These are stats that I'm just throwing out from around the world. The top broadcasters have lost 5 million subscribers, pay TV, in America in the last year, 20 million over the last 5 years. It's a complex landscape and it's changing. Many people wax lyrically, in particular some that might actually be most impacted by the recent thing with the EPL. And who is your guest, the guest star to open the first EPL game, walked off stage? Yes, Mr. Eric Cantona. And the revolution is here. And I will probably be judging that as one of the best PR campaigns of the year at the upcoming Sport Industry Awards. The revolution was here 5 years ago. I think we all know that. It's just a question of when does that balance between how many subscribers do I have go to I have to move this thing onto mobile, which brings in all the other risks of piracy, of containment, of control. But if I don't, I'm not going to have an audience left. So eventually, the shift in demand will dictate when you have to make these moves. And that's, you know, anyone in our industry that is not following Canal Plus is not following Canal Plus and Supersport, and how it impacts on, be it cricket, SAT 20, how it impacts on PSL, how it impacts on everything else, is missing the boat. Reactionary versus, you know, opportunistic. I'm just going to finish on 2 last points, and I know we want to bring people up. Data-driven insights is my other hat. BMI, for 30 years, as I told you, we've measured who watches and who plays every sport. We have the trends. We used to do it exclusively, funny enough, for government. Then we did it exclusively for the broadcasters who had their own questions that wanted to know in terms of purchasing content. And now I think I do it just to be clever and try and stay in business and to guide and to commercialize and to make sure that the dots all connect. We have to move from just knowing who watches and plays to all of this new fan data, which will have tons of implications on piracy, on first-party data, on data protection, opting in, opting out. We've gone through the regulations in Europe. We have our own regulations, PAPIA here in South Africa. And the truth is that I am more likely to be able to get all my fans to come onto my app and or other downstream if they're a true fan of my sport and freely give me their information, because I'm giving them something they love and they want. And when I get that right, and there's a lot of people that are doing it right, and I'm working on fan engagement things right now that are absolutely mind-boggling. The excitement for me as the research nerd is I'll not only know if you love my team, I'll know when you love it, if it's only game time, if it's during the week, if you bought my shirt, what coffee you drink, what car you drive, and you'll be freely giving it to me because you won an award or a loyalty or a badge. And instead of it costing money, like a loyalty program costs to run, I can actually commercialize that space now, and you can shout into my telecom microphone when you clap. And you wave your phone, and you do all these things. You can create a whole new asset class of commercial rights that didn't exist before, which is going to bring up a whole new level of commercial debates going forward. So keep that one on the radar. It's hugely important, as is this, AI. Already it's happening in NBA. I mean, a lot of this started coming out during COVID. We have AI cameras. School sport is based on AI cameras. It's actually cheaper now to produce a lot of low-end sport not using AI cameras because the cost reductions have come down and getting better quality, so that's a debate for another day. NBA's used it. We have commentary. There's a lot of stuff going on here that rights holders, sponsors, fans, everybody has to get involved in. It's going to offer a lot of benefits, but it is ripe for abuse. And it hopefully will keep you guys busy for the next 10 years in terms of that. So this is just all about the shift away from what we like to term as fan engagement to fan involvement, owning the fan, owning the relationship, building that relationship, building communities. This is a little thing from Two Circles who've been bought out, I think, 3 times in the last 4 years in terms of their ability to data-driven science. This is big stuff. It's big to commercialization, it's big to sponsorship, and it's ripe for all of these things that we have to protect to get that we're talking about today. And I think let me leave it there.
Whichever side. Can we get our panelists up? Zola, Jacques, Layckan. While they come and be seated, I just wanted to ask about, SABC, for example. What broadcasters are prepared to pay, obviously, is a function of what advertising revenue they can sell around that broadcast. And a lot of businesses, their advertising budget arguably has been split now because of the internet. So what portion of the money would still go to traditional TV style ads as opposed to what they've already spent on the internet and elsewhere?
Yeah, so it's the old story of cost per point, whether you're advertising, whether it's sponsorship, whether it's broadcast, you're buying eyeballs. You're buying hopefully the right eyeballs, the right LSM group, whatever your target market is. There's probably one of the most interesting things that we didn't talk about today was, between SABC and SuperSport and what have you, was sub-licensing as a secondary issue. And so one of the major issues that keeps getting battered back and forth, CASA or otherwise, competition or otherwise, is when SuperSport sub-licenses the PSL. Correct me if I'm wrong, all the PSL experts, but when SuperSport sub-licenses the PSL to SABC, it may only go on free-to-air terrestrial TV. It may not go on the sport channel, on OpenView. It may not go on the web. It may not be streamed. That's the way they've sold the rights, and that's the way they're purchased, and that's totally fine. The question is that correct? Is that anti-competitive? And it brings up a whole bunch of other issues. The biggest problem in terms of the rights is when you're on SuperSport, you buy the rights, the game may only get 100,000 or 1 million fans, but it gets repeated 42 times. And who is making the decision on the spend is people like us in this room with disposable income that have premium subscriptions that can afford SuperSport, that see it on TV. So you can't help, if you're a rugby sponsor or a soccer sponsor or a cricket sponsor, seeing your brand that your team bought on SuperSport. You can't help it. But if it only showed once live on SABC 1, 2, and 3, and you don't watch that channel, you as the CEO makes it very difficult for you to spend that money. So unless they do a better job marketing and commercializing and telling the people their rights, they're going to have a hard time selling it.
And that leads me on to another question. Another issue with SABC, for example, of course, the BBC is also a national broadcaster funded by license fees, etc. To what extent has the problems regarding, say, sports rights and purchasing sports rights for the SABC suffered due to the dysfunctionality at the SABC? And that, effectively destroyed the market for and potential for sports broadcasting. Do you see a future where they'll ever sort of be able to reorganize themselves and actually be a viable broadcaster in terms of sports broadcasting?
So sorry about that. They always say play the ball, not the man, and a whole bunch of things. That's the age. That's the toughest question to answer, and it's about people, it's about political will, it's about a whole bunch of things. As I said, if you do a one-off quick fix and you get one game on TV, no, that's not the answer. It has to be a strategic plan. So often I've sat at these commissions and said, you know, we're bankrupting SABC by forcing them to take sports rights they can't afford. One of the outcomes that were argued even by the SABC and Free to Air, that you can't force me to take Springboks and pay for it. Who's going to pay for it? I don't have the budget. Just because it's in the national interest. And what is in the national interest? That whole in the public interest. Are the Chiefs in the public interest or only Bafana? If it's based on audience, if it's based on how many people show up. It's a whole quagmire. But at the end of the day, if you do not have a commercial rights plan to sell your broadcast and sponsorship rights, you will fail. Because sports rights are expensive. And if you try and break even as NBC in America on the Olympics, on the amount of money you pay for just that right, you won't. But you will by raising your rate card rate and your channel viewership, and you'll sell it across all of the channels that have a commercial plan that boosts it and make you money in the long run. But it won't happen overnight.
So something else I just wanted to touch on before I go to the panelists is you didn't make good on your promise to speak about women's sport.
It's there, the video's loaded.
But, you know, not just women's sport. So, again, I'm of a certain age when there was only one broadcaster in the SABC. And on a Saturday, like I say, I'm a sports fan and I watch everything. And my impression was that smaller, marginal sports actually got more airtime, like it was then segregated, etc. But you'd see maybe the South African National Table Tennis Championships on a Saturday afternoon. I find that there's even less of that today. And we have Zola here. I always think athletics must be one of the most difficult sports to excel in. You know, you're training on your own. No one's watching you. There are no big stadiums full to watch you train and stuff. And it's maybe a question for Zola. How do you keep young people at it and make them believe that, you know, this is something that they can earn a living from when it's such a solitary grind day in and day out?
I just want to go back to his comment that he made. I think it's not only the SABC that maybe faulted in broadcasting. It's also from my sport, athletics. They had almost, I think, 30 club-sponsored television events over a year in South Africa. And then the ASA came and said, no, we're not going to allow clubs to host televised events anymore, and they cut it down to 4. And since then that happened, athletics has really been struggling. So I think a lot of the problems isn't only with the broadcasting, but you have to work with the federation, and every federation has its own policy and politics. So for instance, if 50% of all the income from all the sponsorship goes to a federation, where does that money end up? I think you also have to address that question, because a lot of the money never ends up on the ground level for athletics development or cross country. Or I'm talking from my sport because I don't know. I'm sorry, but I don't like rugby. So.
You love it.
No. So I only know the big guys play with the small numbers, and the small guys play with the big numbers. That's all I know about it. But
I like that.
So yeah, how do you get kids into the sport? I think what's happening now is with the school sport broadcasting on is it DSTV?
Yeah.
It really exposes a lot of athletics event at junior level and at high school level, which I think is really good. It might come to a point where it might be too competitive for some high schools, but there's always exceptions to the rules. But I think that will help a lot. But to be honest, if you don't get an international sponsorship from an international company from America, as an athlete, you can't really make it financially as a professional athlete in South Africa. You have to get funds from overseas.
Great. These are the challenges, right? Anybody else want to come in at this stage?
Yeah. I just want to discuss a case study, because cricket had 3 tournaments. So we had the global tournament, which we planned, spent 180 million, and we almost hosted it. It just didn't happen. Then we had the Mzansi Super League, a bit of a fallout between SuperSport and CSA, and they said, not to bother, we're going on SABC, higher eyeballs, so we can monetize it, sponsors would love it. We lost 209 million rand in 2 years. Yeah. 2 years. Then the bad boys came along, SuperSport, and they did the SA 20. 50 million rand profit, first edition. So if you look simplistic at it, you go like, okay, but surely if 1.3 million versus 300,000 people view your product, surely sponsorship is going to come on. And to Zola's point, SuperSport's highly effective. They a partner in this league. They got Sundar to bring 6 very rich owners in. Just the mere fact that more people see your product on SABC. My experience of this, and this is a case study, we lost 209 million versus making 50 million rand. So, it is not so simplistic. I agree. If you look at it and you say, I would like to see as many South Africans watch cricket as can, I understand that. But here's a case study that if it wasn't for SuperSport, you wouldn't have had the SA20, which is a huge inflection point for us now in cricket. People are coming, it's a top product, it's well run, well organized. And the partner that doesn't get as much credit as they should is SuperSport, that put it together. Their involvement in sport over a long period of time, both cricket and rugby, has contributed to making it sustainable. So I understand the other debate. I'm all for it. But in my life, I've lived through that 209 million rand loss in 2 years. Thank you.
On this side,
I actually have a question.
I'm sure.
Hi, everybody. So I'm like more the academic here between all the people in practice. So to the speaker, I've got a question. You say you're selling a product to get the sponsorships, right? But the product is the athlete. The athlete is the brand. Why is so little attention actually paid to the athlete and their image rights? And they go to World Cups, they are so restricted to what they can and can't do when they are a brand themselves.
I think I'd leave those to those that represent athletes. Yes, they are, and no, they're not. And when they sign a collective agreement to play for a team, they cede those rights quite simply. And especially if you're on a team sport as opposed to an individual sport. And again, we can argue those things. It's not for me. I'm not a lawyer, but it's the old story. It's like, I think we talked about this a little earlier when you talked about collective and whether that is competition law or not when you pool your rights together. So when 16 clubs or 18 or 22 is in the EPL pool their rights together and collectively sell their broadcast rights, is that wrong? Well, in principle of law, you could argue yes, it is. In reality, commercially, it would not be viable if they didn't.
So you get more for that sum of its parts.
Well, the sum of its parts are more than the individuals, on their own. And so now if you take it to football or whatever, I mean, we have examples, other case studies from Italian leagues or wherever, where the teams are allowed to sell their rights. So 2 teams make all the money from broadcast and the rest are looking for, and only 2 teams will ever win that league as long as it lives. As opposed to, if we had a PSL in this country where only Chiefs and Pirates and Sundowns have enough money as well, so they're okay. But if only those 3 clubs got money from the broadcast rights and could sell them on their own, there would not be another 13 clubs, finishing club. We wouldn't have a league. And so at what point do you say, Stellenbosch, you don't need the broadcast rights, you just go get them on your own. You'll sell your own broadcast rights. Would you be worse off or better off? The balance, as we talked about, or I tried to talk about earlier, that balance between, and Jacques, you put it quite succinctly in the actual rand value, the loss versus the profit. Do we bankrupt the sport because we want to say SuperSport's a bully? No. And did they do anything wrong? Well, we can debate each case on its own. But you have to look at the impact that that's going to have on the commercialization, because at the end of the day, if you win and there's no league anymore, then the athletes have nowhere to play, do they? Right? And so I think one of and I just thought of it now, is one of the things to change to get other sports, and it's coming back to SABC and other free-to-air, is probably the best-known secret in this country is the SABC Sports Channel. And it's not because it's the greatest quality or whatever, it's because it has an opportunity, if it learns to market itself, to have a 24/7 sports channel, which now has capacity to put all these other things in. Now, it may not have the money to produce it. It may not have the money to organize at a level that Supersport can, but if you come with batteries included and give me the content, I can put it on that channel. And I can get comparable audiences that some of the smaller Supersport channels are getting. So these things are possible.
Do you want to add something to that, Michael?
Yes, I mean, you know, just the Supersport model, you can look at it with Sunshine Tour Golf as well. You know, a number of major sponsorship deals were done as a result of the ability to have live Supersport coverage throughout the Sunshine Tour season. Usually it's just over the summer of the major tournaments. And then when that deal was done to have them, you know, in the winter events, so-called smaller 2 million rand tournaments, and you had Supersport broadcasting on site from there, that's very attractive to a sponsor. Three-year sponsorship deals are signed on the basis of that. And just taking it further, the fact that, you know, with that package, you know, it's a made-for package in terms of that tournament, that sponsor. You put that CEO in the booth. He gets the opportunity, she gets the opportunity to commentate a little bit, talk about the company. There's a segment about the company that goes out as well. You know, it's very difficult to put a value on what that means for a sponsor. Then you get to the DP World Tour partnership that comes on board. A city of Cape Town wants to be involved with the Cape Town Open. Why? Because with a DP World Tour partnership combined with Supersport, that's going to over 350 million households worldwide. I know that figure sometimes goes up and down. And it's very hard to get a sponsorship for that value in golf that gives you that kind of global reach. I don't know what the figure would be, but I think for what you pay for that week to be a sponsor of a Sunshine Tour co-sanctioned golf tournament, if you had to pay that to a Pirates or a Chiefs, I think it would be, or a professional, you know, team, it would be significantly more, and yet you get that kind of broadcast reach as a result of that package. So it is a vital one. It really is important.
Yeah, I think Zola reminded me of something. She was speaking about some of the governance topics, Zola, maybe before you arrived, that we spoke about. And Fafa, you also mentioned about the structuring of the boards and the excos and the leadership teams. And it made me think of that saying that turkeys will never vote for Christmas. So you're not going to, there's so many aspects to this thing. But at the end of the day, I mean, we've spoken a lot now about the big sports, football, rugby, and cricket. You know, we need to maximize our commercial value, and we'll get it right. We've been doing it, and it needs to change and so forth. It's absolutely fine. But it's the Cinderella sports. It's all the other sports which really bothers me. Because, you know, we all watch our hockey team as an example at the Olympic Games, and we want them to win. And we think they should win. But yet there's a guy playing there, or a woman playing there over 200 times for their country. They come home, they can't even buy themselves a decent second-hand vehicle. Yeah. But they've represented us 200 times on the hockey field. That to me, and it's not necessarily a sport law challenge, it's these things are all interrelated and just makes us think differently about commercialization of sport, and where the funds get to. So in football, for example, you know, you might think from the outside how wonderful this Club World Cup is that's going to take place next year, 2025 in America, when our season finishes. And there's 4 teams from Africa that will take part with Real Madrid, Liverpool, Chelsea. It's not Spurs. And the participation fee for that is $50 million per team. That's R1 billion. Now, I'm going, is that good? Is that good for Mamelodi Sundowns to get R1 billion? Is it good for the Egyptian team and their league to get R1 million to one club? I'm saying it's really not good, especially when you're saying we don't have VAR, for example. So the money all flows, and it flows maybe sometimes in the wrong direction to be fair, to make sure that there's fair play on and off the field. Because at the end of the day, that's what sport's about. You want a very, very attractive, competitive league. And this is where the Americans get it right sometimes. And that brings sponsorship, commercialization, and so on. So I don't have all the answers, but I do know that I'd like to see more commercialization, more funding flowing to the other sport codes that really struggle to commercialize, partly because of what Jacques mentioned, not enough people of high enough caliber, or we're not learning, we're not studying, we're not getting enough skilled people in our in the different sport codes.
Maybe it's to you, Dave, seeing that you watch the space, obviously now with the internet. Yeah. And broadcasting on the internet, and particularly what you term the Cinderella sports, more niche games. So, there was this concept of the long tail, so that with the internet you can, I guess, cater to more fringe sports. So, for example, a sport that I play, and I know that it doesn't receive much, DSTV now shows it, but before they did was, for example, squash. They started their own online PSA squash TV, and have subscribers for that type of sport. Do you see that as a growth area for, smaller sports?
Yeah, absolutely, and the cost of production and your ability to stream and get things out and create your content. A great historical example of that was the WRC racing. Yeah. And they were the poor cousin, even E1 and all the other ones were coming up, and you had NASCAR and you had Formula One, and this was the poor cousin, and it got taken off TV. And then eventually they put cameras inside the cars, and you could follow the team on the internet. And this goes back 15 years. I mean, this was amazing that they did this way back then. And then you'd follow the team, and then they got a bit of a following. And then with that following, they did a weekend show, a 30-minute highlights for TV. And then that became really popular, and it went to 48 minutes. And then it became, well, let's do the whole series canned, and then it got back on TV live. And the truth is that particularly when it comes to premium subscription, the 1,000 Rand subscribers that DSTV is battling to keep, and that trade-off, well, when do you let it go to get on mobile? That was the revolution that's here, that we're putting it on for $69. You can watch the EPL on your mobile device, and maybe you can afford it now. And so when you get those numbers right, and the market should correct these things and tell us how that works. The market should correct it, but you still need people that can execute it. And I think that's where we got to get a lot better. We really do. But it is accessible. I can hand a tape. Anyone comes to me with their sport that makes it's filmed properly, it's got a minimum quality, I can get that on TV. I can even get you your own corporate, a 24-hour, your own TV channel that I can stream on OpenView or any other platform you want. And it'll come with 14 hours of content, and you can just plug in your hour when you have your sport. And we can start commercializing that if you can bring some partners and sponsors on board. So yeah, it's at the speed of light, it's changing.
Let's get a mic to you.
I've got a couple of questions just for the panel generally, but whoever wants to. How long do you think until we see the kind of dynamic pricing that we've seen in Google advertising, for example, on clickbait ads, where the highest bidder wins the right to sponsor or advert? So when do we start seeing that in sports, and or dynamic pricing? So now that we know what times are the most popular within a game, and attention spans are shorter because we measured when people watch. So NBA fourth quarter, as it gets down to crunch time, more people tune in. Those advertising spots become more valuable, and we start charging more from them or for them. When do we start to see that sort of auction-based ad revenue hitting sports? And the second one question is, I know we can now deliver multiple adverts, particularly on LEDs, jurisdictionally. So sitting in South Africa, the perimeter boards may read one thing. Sitting in the UK, they read something else. But when do we start to see personalized content? So that's basically the ads that are served up to you on your, whatever social media platform. Based on your searches, etc. When do we start seeing that? Around the idea of increasing sports rights and commercial properties. Just any
respond to
That's
that?
only directed to me, but I'll try it. So that's available. Obviously, the technology to have different LED boards in different countries, geo-blocked, virtual advertising on the field. No one paints the field anymore. It's a lot easier. You know, so all that's there. One of the things we've been testing is the next level, and I was talking about data and fans and owning the fan involvement. You can sit on your phone or on your watch and you subscribe to your club and you cheer for them when they score the goal. And we can have a counter running on the bottom of the TV as a squeeze back or as a crawler that says how many people are cheering for Chiefs and how many people are cheering for Stellenbosch in the final of the Cup, or the Pirates in this case, in the final of the Cup. And your fans are cheering to the point where the guy who's cheering the most, his face is coming up with him cheering and doing his happy dance, as long as we don't run foul of broadcasting regulations and make sure that, you know, we don't get some strange things going on. It's not necessarily live, it may be an avatar. All these things have to be checked. That can be done live. Now, why would a SuperSport or a broadcaster? Because they're fans, because their sponsors want to have their logo associated with delivering directly to the fan. The fans are now cheering. Why are they watching SuperSport? Because they're going to see themselves on TV. And they're going to join your supporter club to get extra loyalty points and win a medal and be seen as #1 cheerer fan of the year. So everyone becomes Mama Joy. And we don't have to fly her and the minister doesn't have to pay to take her there. Win, 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 right? That is possible now. The problem is, who's got the balls to do it? Who's ready to start leaping into that thing? And ironically, the chances of it happening here, rather than in America where it's $6 million for a Super Bowl ad, are far greater. So let's wake up. Let's start doing these things. Let's bring the fans in. Nobody wants to see a live sport match with no fans in the stadium.
Well, we've got that through COVID.
Right.
We saw that.
So yeah, this is the next extension. But now we want fans in the stadium as well, and we want to start doing all this other cool stuff.
Zindler, you have a question?
Yes, I just want to find out from the panelists whether there are any trends of esports rising in the African markets and whether we're seeing any trends of us being able to commercialize and have localized streaming platforms on the African continent. The second one is just quickly for David. You had sort of mentioned about the commercialization of data, if you could be able to pull all of the fans into like one app or so. I think there's going to be issues around data subjects informed consent, because most of the time, even if you get the fans all collated in one area, and yes, they like the sports, they actually don't know what it means for their data to be commercialized without them being compensated for it. So just a remark, yeah.
Yeah, so esport, yes. I think we did the first publication for esport about 7 to 10 years ago. In fact, this country, if anyone just went to Comic-Con, there was one in Cape Town, one at Nazareth the other day. The esports section is almost as big as the rest of Comic-Con. We actually introduced gaming and esport to Comic-Con, which was about comic book heroes and a whole bunch of other stuff. Financially, commercially, the bubble is not come. The money's not coming. Those that own it still think they own it and are more clever. But there's a huge misconception, and this is where I get so upset about ABs and data and all the rest of it, because we pontificate about 40 billion people on Facebook and social media that watch the game when there's only 16 million people in the country. And these numbers become so stupid, and there's no regulatory, what is an AVE, what is a real value, how many times do we count the same click and eyeball, that, you know, until someone starts shouting, this is garbage, give me real data. I mean, even on the Springboks playing New Zealand in the Rugby World Cup final, it's public that 10 million people watched it, and they didn't. But if you have something called the cumulative unique audience, which I think is an oxymoron, I'm not an English major, but 5 million people watched it. And that's a good number. Why can't we just tell the truth? But, you know, don't let the facts get in the good way of the story. Esport is finally folding. Esport tried to copy traditional sport. And in many ways, it had everything the same, except it didn't have your long tail. So if you're a football fan, football will be here for another 100 years. And hopefully, depending on who your club is, they'll also be there for another 100 years, right?
Yes,
but if you talk about the game this month in esport, it won't be here. So when you started these esport leagues, it takes 15 to 20 years for a league to be commercially viable, but your game's finished in 5, and the next game has come in to take its place. Your league is finished, and we've seen that already in the most commercial American-modeled esports. The other problem with esports is a view isn't the same thing as an AR. And so, I mean, we waxed lyrically about how esport and what was the biggest League of Legends or whatever tournament was bigger than the NFL Supersport. Not in your life. Never. And in Africa, it's worse because the concurrent view is I can view it 42 times in 6 minutes because I keep losing connection on my phone. And that's another view, and it's another view, and it's another view. And he told 2 friends and told 2 friends and so on and so forth. And the reported values on esport aren't a lie. They're just not necessarily the truth. Because what they include is all of gaming, which is an esport. Yeah. And that's a massive sector that includes Disney and EA Sport and Sony and Samsung and everything else. So where we're getting traction now in Africa is that Saudi and other, and I think Samsung or Sony, one of them are putting money into funding of leagues and sports. And we're probably in the leadership role with Telkom and VS Gaming doing great stuff here.
One last question before I incur the wrath of Annette. She's already shaking her head, but let's take one more question.
My question is more directed at brand, because that's the site that I'm on. So what happens this year, a player signs, let's say Stellenbosch FC player, they sign with Coca-Cola for an ambassadorship. Then in 2025, Pepsi decides they want to sponsor the entire team. What happens then to my endorsement deal? Does the team take preference? Do I go into, I have to sign with the team, or does my deal still be enforced? And then to a second part to that, what happens if what the team has signed on to does not align with my brand? So I think it was in the MMA where there's like an African fighter, and he's constantly knocking the Monster off the tables when they do the press. So what happens then? Because as Monster, I've paid a certain amount, and these athletes that are speaking don't align with my brand because he could have a personal deal with Play or Red Bull. So where does the player's, his deal kind of and sponsorship come into play in the greater scheme of other advertising and brands?
Yeah, it's a complicated. I think even in one of the tournaments, Ronaldo, I think, took the drink off and he said drink water or something like that. Yeah. But
alcohol.
Yeah, maybe I could share a little bit. So yeah, these are individual cases. So usually when a team signs a contract with a sponsor, individuals in that team might have their own sponsorships, like you say. So let's take Boots as an example. You know, Stellenbosch signs up a new deal with Adidas as our new technical sponsor, but our goalkeeper has got a Puma endorsement. It's in existence, we'll allow him to continue. And it's discussed, and the partners, everybody knows about it. No new players will potentially be allowed to go to anything else. Boots is maybe a bad example because we let any player play with any boots. This is their tool that you don't want to give them any excuses. Last year, as you know, we did quite well. Stellenbosch did quite well in the Carling Black Label Cup, remember? We won that one. We had a player that really didn't like this tournament's name because they don't believe in drinking alcohol. So they didn't want to play with the Carling Black Label on their shirt. We discussed it with the sponsor. They were actually okay with it. And then we said to the player, now remember, when you get selected for player of the match, it's 100,000 Rand. They gave a lot of money away for player of the match. You can't take the money. He went on to win 400,000 Rand. But he played with Carling Black Label on his shirt. So you've got to decide what you want. I mean, there's been many examples like this, Shark, also with you know, the Proteas as well, with Castle and Umla and so on. So there are lots of examples like this, but typically you'll know what your players, which private endorsements they've got. You should be aware of all of that and know how that's going to potentially impact any team sponsorships that get concluded.
But great, that's been a great session.
So let's make it a 10-minute tea break. Is that okay? Okay. But great. Thanks, everyone.